It was the worst moment of my life. My son was unconscious in the ER, monitors beeping like a countdown, and I felt like the sterile scent of antiseptic was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. The room felt too white, too bright, and too empty of the warmth a mother needed when her child's small hand refused to grip hers. I held Liam's hand anyway, his tiny fingers limp in mine, and tried to keep my breathing even, but inside me was a storm that had no eye, just wave after wave of panic and helplessness, crashing into the fragile shores of my sanity. The nurse had just adjusted the 4-line in his arm, her face calm and efficient, and I hated her for that calm, hated that someone could move so easily through this nightmare while I sat frozen, my whole world reduced to the rise and fall of my little boy's chest. I had never felt more powerless. The doctors were still running tests, something about a possible seizure, maybe an allergic reaction, maybe something worse, and all I could do was sit there beside his bed, watching the numbers jump and dip on the monitor like they held the answers I couldn't begin to understand. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone, desperate for some anchor in the storm, someone who would hear the cracking in my voice and reach through the chaos to steady me. I texted my mother, because no matter how old we are, sometimes all we want is our mom to tell us it's going to be okay. Liam is in the ER, I typed, my hands barely able to form the words. He collapsed. They don't know what's wrong yet. I'm scared. I stared at the message for a long moment before pressing send, as if staring could somehow change the outcome, could soften the blow I was already bracing for. I waited, staring at the screen, willing her name to pop up with a comforting reply. My mother, Martha, wasn't the warmest person, but surely this time, she would rise above her usual coldness, above her favoritism, above whatever pettiness usually ruled her responses. This was her grandson, her flesh and blood. This was a crisis. The phone buzzed in my hand, and for one split second, I let hope bloom, naive and desperate, as if the tiniest thread could still tether me to safety. But then I read her reply, and the world shifted. We're busy with Margaret, she wrote. 5 words. 5 words that fell like ice down the back of my neck. My heart thudded hard in my chest, a sound too loud for the quiet of the ER room. My son was unconscious, and she was busy. With Margaret. Of course it was Margaret. Always Margaret. I read it again just to be sure I hadn't misunderstood, that maybe it was autocorrect or some cruel miscommunication. But there it was, plain, sharp, and utterly intentional. We're busy with Margaret. As if that explained everything. As if it excused her absence. As if my fear didn't warrant even a phone call. I barely had time to let the shock settle before her next message arrived, and that one shattered something that had already been fractured for years. He's probably being dramatic again. He always was the weak one. My thumb froze above the screen. Weak. Dramatic. Again. The words bled into my vision, refusing to let me look away, refusing to let me lie to myself any longer. My mother had just mocked her grandson, my son, while he lay unconscious in a hospital bed, and she hadn't even bothered to hide the cruelty behind concern. She didn't even pretend. I felt something inside me go quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes with peace, but the kind that comes with finality, with the kind of realization that severs ties no matter how tightly they were once woven. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my phone across the room and watch it shatter the same way my heart had just shattered. But instead, I turned the screen off and slipped it back into my pocket like it was just another object, another piece of evidence that the person I had once called Mom no longer existed, not in the way I needed, not in the way I deserved. I looked back at Liam, his face too pale, his little chest rising and falling with a rhythm that didn't match the chaos in mine. I leaned down and kissed his forehead, whispering words I didn't believe yet, hoping somehow they would wrap around him like armor. You're strong, I said softly. You're not weak. You're the strongest boy I know. The nurse returned to check his vitals, her voice kind but clinical, and I nodded along with whatever she said, not really hearing it, not really here. Part of me was still back in that text thread, still reading those words, still feeling the sting that came not from strangers, but from the woman who raised me. Or tried to, at least. I remembered being 10 years old and having a fever so high I couldn't stand, and Margaret had a dance recital the same night. Mom made me stay in the car with a bottle of water while she went inside to watch Margaret twirl on stage. "Just close your eyes," she'd said, brushing off my tears. "You'll feel better soon." I had curled up in the back seat, shivering and alone, while applause thundered through the walls of the auditorium. That was the night I stopped asking for help. That was the night I learned that in our family, love wasn't given freely. It was rationed, and Margaret always got the lion's share. I thought becoming a mother myself would change how she saw me, that watching me raise my son would soften her, would create a bridge over the decades of disappointment. But now, sitting in the cold glow of fluorescent lights, watching machines breathe for the little boy who called me Mommy in the middle of the night, I knew better. My mother hadn't changed. She never would. But I had. Because fury was a funny thing, it didn't always arrive with fire and shouting. Sometimes it arrived in silence, in the quiet decision that you were done begging for crumbs. That you would no longer shrink yourself to fit into someone else's broken idea of love. When the doctor came in and told me they were moving Liam to the pediatric intensive care unit, I nodded and stood without trembling. I gathered our things and walked alongside the gurney, my fingers never leaving his hand. I was no longer crying. I was no longer waiting. I was becoming steel. And somewhere, deep in the center of my chest where grief and rage had once fought for dominance, a new resolve began to take root. It didn't need permission. It didn't need her approval. It only needed one thing: to protect my son. The first time I realized I was invisible to my own mother, I was 9 years old and holding a red construction paper valentine I'd spent the entire week making in art class, gluing tiny paper hearts and carefully outlining her name with glitter I'd fought my classmates for. I remember how my hands trembled with excitement as I waited for her to pick me up from school, clutching the card so tightly the edges bent. When she arrived, 20 minutes late and smelling like the perfume she only wore on nights she was meeting Margaret's dance teacher for dinner, I ran to her with the card outstretched. She barely glanced at it, muttered, "How cute," and tossed it into the back seat without opening it. Later that night, I found it on the floor of the car, trampled and torn, glitter smeared like bruises across the crumpled red paper. That memory has lived inside me like a fossil, preserved perfectly, untouched by time, buried beneath layers of other disappointments that would come in thicker, heavier slabs with each passing year. There was never one moment that broke me, no single betrayal so sharp it shattered everything in one blow. Instead, there were 1,000 little slices, so small on their own I might have forgiven them, but layered together they became something I carried like a weight on my chest, invisible to everyone except me. After that night in the ER, something inside me started to crack open, not with pain, but with clarity. Liam had been transferred to the pediatric ICU and stabilized after a series of scans and blood work. The doctors now suspected a rare but manageable seizure disorder, something we could treat and manage with the right care. I sat in the hospital room, the soft hum of the machines a kind of lullaby to my overworked mind, and I started to think not just about Liam, but about everything. About all the times I had given and all the ways they had taken. About how my kindness had never been seen as love but as weakness. About how I'd paid their mortgage for the last 5 years without so much as a thank you card in return. The first time they asked for help, it was my father who called. He'd sounded frail, apologetic, even a little ashamed when he explained that they'd fallen behind on payments after a few unexpected medical bills and some poor financial planning. I was 26 at the time, a new mother with a newborn barely sleeping through the night, and a part-time job that left me more exhausted than fulfilled. But I said yes, without thinking, without calculating. Because that's what daughters are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to show up. They're supposed to carry the weight when others stumble. I paid the mortgage that month. And the next. And then the next after that. Eventually, I just set up autopay. It was easier than having to hear my father mumble through another excuse about why they were short again. I told myself it was temporary. That once things stabilized, they'd take back the reins. But they never did. Instead, they added more to the pile, quietly, subtly, like slipping bricks into my backpack one at a time. First it was their car loan, then their internet and cable bills. When my mother needed a new prescription that insurance wouldn't fully cover, she didn't even ask. She just sent me a PayPal request with a note. Be a good girl. That was her humor. Cold. Condescending. Designed to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. Margaret never paid a cent. She never had to. She was the golden child, the gleaming ornament at the top of a tree that I had spent my whole life watering. My mother always said Margaret was sensitive, as if that excused the way she screamed at waitresses when her soup was too cold or the way she stormed out of Thanksgiving dinner when I didn't praise her latest Etsy candle launch. She's an artist, my mom would say, as though burning scented wax in her boyfriend's garage qualified her as Van Gogh. When Margaret needed a car, my parents co-signed the loan and defaulted on it 6 months later, forcing me to pay it off before their credit tanked even further. I never got a thank you call. Just a casual, Margaret says the brakes are squeaking again. Can you look into that? I was invisible when I aced my exams. I was invisible when I got the promotion that helped pay for their plumbing repair. I was invisible when I stayed up all night to finish a project and still got up at dawn to take Liam to school. But Margaret? Margaret got applause for remembering my birthday 2 days late and texting HB sis with a balloon emoji. I used to tell myself they loved me in their own way. That maybe they didn't know how to show it. That maybe I just wasn't the kind of daughter they'd expected, and that wasn't their fault. Maybe I was too quiet, too serious, too unwilling to play the part of the good daughter who smiled and giggled and didn't ask where all the money went. But now, as I sat beside Liam's hospital bed and watched his chest rise and fall, those lies tasted like poison on my tongue. They hadn't just failed to love me properly, they had chosen not to, over and over again. And I had let them. I remembered a Christmas 5 years ago when I showed up with armfuls of gifts, each one wrapped with care and attention. Margaret had forgotten to bring anything, not even a card. And yet, when my mother opened the cashmere scarf I'd bought her and said, "You shouldn't have spent so much," her voice wasn't touched, it was accusing. Later that night, she posted a picture of her and Margaret on Facebook with the caption, "Nothing better than being with my girls." I wasn't in the photo. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes while they posed for the camera. That's when I started documenting everything. Not for revenge, not for proof, but because I needed something real to hold on to when they made me question my own reality. I kept records of every payment I made for them, every bill I covered, every loan I forgave. I wrote down their messages, the passive-aggressive texts, the forgotten birthdays, the insults cloaked in jokes. I kept them like someone might keep love letters, except mine were a record of neglect. I needed those receipts. Because the gaslighting wasn't just occasional, it was the air they breathed. "You're too sensitive," my mother would say when I told her she hurt my feelings. "You always take things so personally," she'd laugh after making a joke about Liam's speech delay. I once told her I felt left out when Margaret was always chosen for family events, and she replied, "Well, maybe if you weren't so negative all the time." The truth was, I wasn't negative. I was exhausted. I was tired of loving people who saw me as a resource, not a relative. I was tired of being the sturdy one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need anything. The thing about being the strong one is that no one ever checks if you're okay. They just assume you'll keep carrying the weight, no matter how heavy it gets. But I wasn't going to carry it anymore. The night before Liam was discharged, I sat by the window in the hospital room, staring out at the city lights, blinking like distant signals I couldn't quite decipher. He was sleeping peacefully, thanks to the medication, and I found myself thinking about the last time I cried in front of my mother. I was 15, humiliated at school after a rumor Margaret had started about me dating a teacher. It wasn't true, of course. But Margaret had a way of saying things with just enough smoke to make everyone believe there was fire. I came home that day, mascara smeared, shoulders shaking, and I told my mother everything. I told her how the other kids laughed, how even teachers looked at me differently, how I wanted to disappear. She didn't hug me. She didn't comfort me. She sighed, pulled a casserole out of the oven, and said, "Well, maybe you shouldn't have been so friendly with him." Just like that. A dismissal dressed as wisdom. That was the last time I cried in front of her. But now, as I sat beside my son, the tears came not from sadness, but from release. From letting go of the idea that they would ever be the family I needed. From letting go of the fantasy that if I just worked hard enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, they would finally love me the way I had always begged them to. I cried not because they had failed me, but because I had finally stopped hoping they wouldn't. I didn't tell them when Liam was discharged. I didn't send an update. I didn't answer the follow-up message my mother finally sent 2 days later, asking, "Is he still being dramatic, or is there actually something wrong?" I let it sit unread. I let her words disappear into the silence I now controlled. Instead, I went home with my son. I made him pancakes the next morning, even though he only picked at them. I sat with him on the floor and built Lego towers while the laundry piled up. I held him when he cried and whispered promises I intended to keep. Promises like, "You will never feel invisible in this house." Promises like, "You don't have to earn love here." And while he napped, I pulled out the manila folder where I had stored every receipt, every invoice, every proof of the life I'd quietly funded for people who didn't even bother to say thank you. I opened a spreadsheet. I began documenting not just the numbers, but the patterns, the manipulations, the emotional debts they never intended to repay. I wasn't sure what I would do with it yet, but it felt like the beginning of something. Something mine's. It began with a single sentence, typed quietly into my phone in the stillness of Liam's hospital room while the monitors hummed their hypnotic rhythm and the world outside kept spinning as if nothing had changed. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering above the send button like it was the trigger of a weapon I'd never wanted to fire. But eventually, without fanfare, I pressed it. "Since Margaret is who matters, let her handle your bills now." That was it. Just one line. No anger. No pleading. No explanation. I didn't need to justify it. I had already spent a lifetime doing that. I turned the screen face down on the side table, leaned back in the worn vinyl chair beside Liam's bed, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. It was not a dramatic breath, not the kind you see in movies where a woman finds liberation and throws her arms to the sky. It was quiet, heavy, slow, a breath that left my chest aching in its absence, as if I'd been holding it since I was 9 years old with that crumpled Valentine card in my hands. It took less than 20 minutes for the first reply to come through. It wasn't my mother's voice I heard, not directly. It was the silence that came before the storm, the kind that settled in the bones like a cold front. Her reply wasn't immediate. I imagined her sitting at the kitchen table in that house I'd kept running for the last 6 years, rereading my message with those pursed lips she wore like a weapon, looking around the room for the script she'd used her entire life: shame, guilt, obligation. When the reply finally landed, I didn't flinch. "Is this some kind of joke?" she wrote, like I'd sent her a meme instead of a reckoning. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I had already said everything I needed in that single, unbending sentence. I had no more explanations left to give. No more justifications. No more bridge building for people who had gleefully lit the matches behind me every time I dared to walk toward them. Instead, I opened my banking app. I started with the mortgage. I'd been covering it since the summer after Dad's back surgery, the one they insisted wasn't a big deal until the hospital bills came in and suddenly their hands were outstretched like they always were. I canceled the autopay, knowing full well the next payment was due in 3 days. Then I moved to the car loan, the one for the SUV Margaret needed after her third failed job in 2 years, the one I had been covering monthly even though I didn't drive it, didn't ride in it, and didn't even know what color it was. Gone. I hit cancel again. Then again. Insurance. Utilities. Their cable and internet. Even the Netflix account. Yes, the one that still listed me as user 1 while Margaret had cheekily renamed hers the favorite. Gone. Every lifeline I had given them, every string they had tied around my neck under the guise of family loyalty, I severed one by one, watching the weight fall away like pieces of a costume I no longer needed to wear. The first real sign of chaos arrived in the form of a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I played it with my back turned to the window, watching the afternoon sunlight stretch long across the floor. A woman's voice, clipped and professional, informed me that the mortgage payment had failed, and unless a resolution was made within 5 business days, the account would be reported for delinquency. I smiled, not because I found pleasure in their misfortune, but because I had finally stopped confusing their problems for my responsibilities. Then came the flood. Texts, missed calls, emails, even a handwritten note that showed up on my porch 2 days later, folded into a floral card that looked suspiciously like something pulled from the clearance bin at Walgreens. "We're disappointed in you," the card read, in my mother's familiar cursive. "After everything we've done for you." It didn't even come with a stamp. Margaret must have dropped it off on her way to whatever retreat or juice cleanse or crisis she was currently manufacturing. I didn't reply. Not to the texts accusing me of betrayal. Not to the emails begging for reconsideration. Not even to the furious voicemail my father left in the dead of night, his voice trembling with something he'd never shown me before. Not rage, not even sadness, but confusion. Like a man who had just realized his house had no foundation. I stayed silent. Because silence, I was learning, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of power. The family group chat, once a dusty scroll of Margaret's vacation photos and my mother's forwarded chain messages, exploded like a dropped match in a dry forest. My phone lit up with notifications as each family member, one after the other, weighed in on my decision as if it were up for debate. "Can we just talk about this?" Margaret wrote first, always pretending she was the peacemaker while never once lifting a finger to fix the damage she helped cause. Then came the guilt. My uncle sent a message about how family helps family and how he remembered changing my diapers and couldn't understand how I'd become so cold. My aunt chimed in with a carefully worded monologue about how this kind of attitude was what tore families apart. Someone even sent a Bible verse. I didn't respond. Liam was recovering slowly but steadily, and that was where my attention lived now, in the slow, steady beat of his heart, in the way he gripped my finger a little tighter each day, in the soft, sleepy mumble he made when he asked if we could go home soon. Every ounce of energy I had was wrapped around him like a shield, and there was nothing left for anyone who had shown me so clearly I was never worth protecting. I read their messages, sometimes out loud, sometimes in my head, always with the same detachment one might read an old diary from middle school, amused, mildly horrified, and absolutely unwilling to go back. And Margaret? She was silent. Not a word. Not a call. Not a visit. Not even a passive-aggressive meme posted to her social media story. I watched as days turned into weeks, and not once did she offer to pay the bills I had been covering for over half a decade. Not once did she reach out to our parents with more than a shrug or a "that sucks." She simply vanished into the very comfort that had always been crafted for her, wrapped in her own self-importance like a fur coat she didn't deserve. Eventually, the texts turned nastier. My mother wrote, "How can you let this happen to us? We raised you." To which I replied nothing, because she hadn't raised me, not really. I had raised myself in the shadows of their neglect, grown tall and resilient like a weed in a sidewalk crack, unaltered and unwanted, but alive nonetheless. Then came the rage. "You ungrateful girl," she texted one night. "You always were jealous of Margaret. You think being a martyr makes you special." The message went on for 4 paragraphs. I didn't read the last 2. I muted the thread and went back to reading Liam his favorite bedtime story, brushing his curls back from his forehead and whispering the words he loved to hear. "You're safe. You're strong. You are mine." The part of me that used to ache for their approval, the part that spent years building my life around making them comfortable, had gone quiet. No dead. Just irrelevant. They called the hospital once, asking for updates on Liam, pretending to care. The nurse politely informed them that due to new privacy protocols, they would need my written consent to access any information. I never gave it. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I had finally realized that some information, like my son's well-being, was sacred. And sacred things don't belong to people who never treated them with reverence. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want groveling apologies. I didn't even want understanding. What I wanted, what I finally had, was distance. Not just physical miles, but emotional freedom. The kind that comes when you finally stop knocking on doors that will never open for you. Liam came home on a Thursday morning, his little backpack slung over one shoulder, filled with hospital drawings and get-well cards from nurses who adored him. I carried him up the front steps of our house, the same house I'd worked overtime to keep, the same house where every picture frame held moments of just us, and I looked around at the life I had built with my own hands, brick by brick, no help, no shortcuts. And in that moment, I realized something simple and staggering. It was the kind of morning that made you forget, for a moment, that the world could ever be anything but kind. A soft breeze through the open kitchen window, the quiet chatter of birds settling onto power lines, and the distant hum of a lawnmower that felt less like noise and more like music wrapped in memory. I stood barefoot in my kitchen, warm mug in hand, watching sunlight stretch itself across the hardwood floors like it had been waiting for an invitation. The house once filled with worry and the sterile scent of hospital sanitizer now held nothing but peace. Peace, I was learning, did not always arrive in grand gestures or triumphant declarations. Sometimes it came softly, like the first breath after a long dive, like the sound of your child laughing from the next room without coughing halfway through. Liam's giggles floated down the hall just then, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting them wrap around me like the softest armor I had ever worn. He was healthy. He was whole. And he was watching me in a way that made me want to keep becoming the kind of woman I'd always hoped he would see. In the months that had followed our great unraveling, the night I sent the message that changed everything, I had expected some part of me to break. I had braced for guilt to come sneaking back like an old ghost, for shame to reclaim its spot in the pit of my stomach, for doubt to whisper that maybe I had overreacted. But none of them came. Or if they did, they found the door locked, the lights turned off, the furniture moved. Instead, something else bloomed inside me, slowly at first, tentatively, like a flower unsure if it's safe to grow in the new soil. Confidence. Not the loud kind that demands applause, but the kind that lives in the quiet spaces between decisions, the kind that stands taller without needing to explain why. Liam noticed it first. He had always been perceptive, the way sensitive children often are, with eyes that seemed to see beyond what you said and into what you meant. One morning, about a month after we returned home, he crawled into my bed with his usual tangle of limbs and blankets and whispered, "Mommy, you smile different now." I asked him what he meant, and he thought for a long time, chewing the edge of his sleeve like he did when he was trying to be precise. "It doesn't look tired anymore," he said finally. "It looks strong." And I knew right then that no matter what had been lost, no matter the phone calls left unanswered, the family texts I had silenced, the bridges I had watched collapse behind me, I had gained something far more sacred. My son was watching me become a woman who protected peace like it was air. A woman who no longer watered dead things and called it loyalty. By the time spring turned to summer, my parents tried to find their way back. It started the way it always did, with a holiday. My mother texted me about 4th of July plans, pretending that nothing had happened, as if 6 months of silence could be erased by the promise of grilled corn and sparklers. It would be lovely to see Liam, she wrote. Not you, not we miss you, just him, as if I were the unpaid Uber driver for their preferred grandchild. I didn't reply. Not out of cruelty, but because I had learned not to reach for hands that only extended when they wanted something. A few days later, my father called. The first call since his last voicemail had been deleted without a second thought. I let it go to voicemail again, and when I played it back later that night, I didn't feel the tightness in my chest that used to come with his voice. We've been doing some thinking, he said, his tone uncertain, and maybe we didn't handle things perfectly. Maybe you misunderstood, but, well, can't we just move on? It was always the same song. Different lyrics, same tune. And maybe once I would have softened. Maybe once I would have interpreted maybe you misunderstood as the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. But now I knew the truth. I hadn't misunderstood a damn thing. I had seen it clearly, maybe for the first time in my entire life, and I had chosen to stop pretending the knife in my back was a back scratch. So I called them. Not out of anger, not out of hope, but out of necessity. I owed myself the gift of boundaries, and I knew they would never find the line unless I drew it in ink they could no longer erase. My mother answered, her voice artificially bright, the kind of tone she used when she was expecting company. Darling, she said, like the word didn't taste foreign in her mouth. We were just talking about you. Your father and I. I'm not coming for the 4th, I said, not harshly, but clearly. And neither is Liam. There was a pause, short but charged, the kind of pause that bristled with the need to retaliate. Oh, sweetheart, don't be so dramatic, she began, and I almost smiled at the predictability of it. I'm not being dramatic, I said evenly. I'm being clear. Another pause. Then, her voice hardened. We've always done our best for you. We helped you so much when you were younger. You're right, I interrupted, and she sounded surprised. You helped shape me. Every time you dismissed me, every time you called Margaret your pride and joy, every time you made me pay for your mistakes, you taught me exactly who I don't want to be. So thank you for that. Her breath caught. I let the silence settle like dust. I don't hate you, I added, because I didn't. But I don't owe you my presence anymore. Not when your love comes with a price tag. Not when your affection only shows up when the mortgage is late. We're family, she whispered, and I could hear the panic starting to crack through. We are, I agreed. But I'm Liam's family first. And I will not let him grow up thinking love is something you have to earn by setting yourself on fire. I hung up before she could respond. And then I breathed again. Boundaries, I had discovered, were not walls to keep people out. They were fences to keep the garden of your life safe. And mine was blooming. Work was slower now, by choice. I had turned down 2 promotions because they would have demanded late nights and early mornings I wasn't willing to sacrifice anymore. I started freelancing, choosing clients carefully, only taking on projects that aligned with the values I now wore like skin. Money wasn't flowing the way it once did, but I found I didn't need as much. Simplicity had become a kind of wealth that couldn't be taxed. Liam was thriving. He had started speech therapy and was already improving by leaps and bounds. He made friends more easily, spoke up in class, and started referring to our house as the fun house, which I took as the highest possible compliment a 6-year-old could bestow. Every time he told someone, "My mommy's brave," I felt like a cathedral was being built in my chest, brick by brick, window by stained glass window. Margaret reached out once. Just once. She sent an email with a subject line that read, "Can we talk?" The message was short. Vague apologies. Passive acknowledgments. No specifics. No accountability. Just a thin veil of guilt masked as reconciliation. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I had finally stopped mistaking proximity for connection. She had her chance. I had spent decades waiting for her to show up for me the way I had always shown up for everyone else, but I finally realized she never would. And that was okay. Not everyone gets to grow with you. Some people only existed in the chapters you had to close in order to write the one that finally belongs to you. On Liam's birthday, we baked cupcakes from scratch and decorated them with crooked sprinkles and too much frosting. He invited 3 kids from school, and I let them destroy the living room with laughter and sugar and spilled juice boxes. I didn't take photos for Instagram. I didn't send any to my parents. I didn't try to make the day perfect. I made it real. That night, after he fell asleep with frosting still on his cheek and a Lego piece clutched in his tiny fist, I sat on the porch and watched the stars blink into existence one by one. I thought about who I used to be, the girl who bent herself into shapes just to be chosen, the woman who thought love had to be earned through sacrifice. And then I thought about the woman I had become, the one who stood tall not because someone told her she could, but because she finally realized she never needed permission. They thought I needed them, but when my son needed me, I learned the truth. Subscribe to read more stories like this, because sometimes the quietest people write the loudest endings.